So we discussed yesterday was the reasons that led up to the flood and the idea of the flood being a new beginning. We spoke about why Noach is mentioned as being so unique that he could be saved from the waters of the flood. We spoke about his preparations, his warning of other people. We spoke about why it had to be through water. Any questions on yesterday's stuff? Those were the animals that stayed within their own species. Okay, this is also one of the reasons that from the Torah's perspective, you should find fossils of animals that are extinct, because it says explicitly that animals were extincted during the flood. So I mean, I find it interesting that people will say that the fossils somehow disprove Torah when, like, it's very apparent that there should be fossils. Okay, clear?
Is it possible that, like, the flood could have aged things?
Aging is very tricky. Does this interest the rest of you?
Yeah.
Carbon aging. So here's how carbon dating works. There's X amount of carbon in, let's say, a piece of coal. Okay, for it to emerge as a diamond, it would require more or less carbon progressively. More. Okay, so it's this much today, it's more tomorrow, more still. Okay, this is how. But that works on the premise that everything is as it is now. Okay, but if anything changes, then we have no way of knowing except through what we call extrapolation. So in science, are you sure this interests you? Okay, some of you look like you're about to die. Okay, but in science, there are two, like, you learned about what the scientific method is when you were in high school. It's something to be considered a scientific fact has to be observable, repeatable, definable. Extrapolations, by definition, aren't repeatable. So because of that, the further the extrapolation, the more likely it is to be a non-scientific idea as opposed to a scientific fact. Okay, you understand this? So I'll give you an example of how like a good scientist has a very open mind. Okay, so something as basic as, let's say, Newtonian physics, which nobody thinks is an accurate picture of the world anymore, right? Since Einstein, nobody thinks it's true. Nobody thinks Newton was a liar. He was describing things as he saw them. But because it involved extrapolation, it's possible that somebody will see something more. Okay, it was a given, for instance, that we could decide whether the Earth revolves around the sun or the sun around the Earth. Which is the truth? Which revolves around which? Okay, so in terms of what we could observe easily, certainly the Earth around the sun. That's what the whole solar system is about. But once you have a relative view of the world, of the universe, you'll say you could never tell what's revolving around what. Okay, because it all depends on where you're standing. Okay, this is clear? So a scientist keeps an open mind, and the further the extrapolation is, the more room there is for saying, huh? So from a Judaic perspective, we would definitely say that carbon dating describes things as far as you could see in a very limited frame. If everything was the same as it is today, even though certainly we know there was an ice age, certainly we know there was a flood, certainly we know that everything isn't as it is today, then this is how carbon dating would work. So the closer it is to now, the more accurate carbon dating will be. The further it is, the more questionable it'll be. So that's one thing to take into consideration with carbon dating. Another thing to take into consideration is that there are many other ways of talking about the age of anything. One is, you know that there are many levels within the Earth. So the lower the layer is, the older you'll assume something to be. But you see, like in Colorado, they found dinosaur bones like right on the surface. With, you know, so there are all sorts of things we don't have a full picture yet. So here's the one thing I will tell you that we do have a picture of. Science and Torah are describing two different things. Science is describing how does it look, and it can get a pretty accurate picture of this. Torah is describing where did it come from, what is it for. It's a different question. Okay, clear? So it's not like two people who are going like this. It's one person is here, one person is there. So Torah describes the ruchnius of what could be seen. Science describes the externality of what could be seen. Okay, clear? Okay. I find it also, this is just an aside, I really shouldn't waste your time on this, but I was at one of these big conventions where there are a lot of rabbis and speakers, So somebody in Kirov asked the presenting rabbi, from a scientific view, the earth is much older than it would be from the Torah's view. How would you explain that to anybody? And he asked him, did any of your students at the university ever ask you this question? What do you think the answer is, thinking the way students think today? Is this a good Kirov question or not? Do people ask this?
Yes, they do all the time.
Absolutely not. That's not the issue. What?
I've heard questions.
No, it's a real question. The question is a good question. He was just pointing out that today's Kirov issues usually have to do with the relevance of Torah, the truth of the Torah being from God, the reality of God. People aren't so interested in this anymore. So the reason it seems to me why people are less interested in this, like a burning question will be how does the Torah treat homosexuals and why? Not how does the Torah treat carbon dating and why. It doesn't get the same kind of passion. The reason is that I think we're at a point where anybody who studies science realizes that science is a work in progress. It isn't like it was in the 19th century where they thought they knew everything. Okay, clear? Okay, moving on. Okay, so the flood. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today is life on the ark, why it was the way it was, and what happened next. Okay, so life on the ark was a nightmare. Why am I saying that? What was so nightmarish about being on the ark?
Because it says when the flood was on the earth for 40 days, the water increased, and then in the commentaries it said that the ark was violently moved and tossed aimlessly.
Yeah, first of all, it's like, okay, you can get seasick on the ark. What do you think Noach and his wife and his children and their wives were doing all day long? No. They had to take care of every species of animal. Do you realize what that is? They had no days, they had no nights. They were constantly involved in care of the animals. Okay, they didn't have a second respite. And the Midrash says that Noach, it says when he left, it says Ach Noach, just Noach. I mean, he left with barely alive. He says he was coughing blood, he was limping, it was a terrible 40 days. So why do you think, in terms of the world's future, God could have saved Noach any way he wanted to. He could have made a high mountain with a cave and had them sit comfortably in the cave until the flood was... He could have done anything. Okay, why did he need this 40 days of horror? Okay, so once they had to appreciate being alive. But as we said yesterday, the root of all of the sins was leaving, giving, and adapting, taking. Is this not so? So they had to be moved into a situation of extreme, constant giving in order to reestablish the world. They had to give 24 hours a day, 40 days. There was no respite from giving. So this is how tikkun works. The soul doesn't need tikkun. The soul is perfect. It says in the daily prayers, the soul you gave me, Hashem, is pure. What needs tikkun? Your body needs tikkun. Your emotions need tikkun. So this was for the sake of tikkun. So realize whenever life pushes you into a corner, what's happening is tikkun.
What is this tikkun?
Tikkun means rectification. So when you're talking about having faith in Hashem, the way faith works is recognizing that everything can only come from one address, Hashem, that Hashem is compassionate, and if something doesn't feel like an act of compassion, if you're being pushed into a corner and you can't bear it, you are experiencing tikkun. Okay, clear? So what's the best question to ask? If you were Noach, and like you just finished feeding the lions and the birds are already up, okay, what question could you ask yourself that would make this make sense? Because I want to tell you the question that makes sense. It's not why is this happening, because you may never find out. Who should I be at this moment? What is this moment demanding of me? So if you could ask this question, you never get lost in life. So I want to tell you the questions that don't work. Why is this happening to me? You may never find out. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. It could go either way. Why me? Okay, why me? Okay, yeah. You may find out, you may not find out. Okay, why this? You may find out, you may not find out. Do I like it or not? That's a valid question when you're going to your psychologist, but it's not a valid question for self-discovery. Who should I be at this moment? Okay? So if you could ask yourself that, you will always know to turn something into the tikkun it was meant to be. So I'm going to give you an extreme example of this. One of the great Rebbes in pre-war Europe was the Klosenberger Rebbe, who you probably never heard of. He lost his entire family. For him, the hardest loss was the loss of his last son, who somehow managed to survive until literally the very last couple of days. So when the camps were liberated, it didn't happen in like a second. It wasn't black to white. The Nazis were aware of the progress of the Allies, and they wanted to kill as many Jews as possible. So they abandoned some of the concentration camps and had the Jews do forced work walking in the direction of Germany. So the son died on one of these forced walks after having survived 5 years of horror. Okay, clear? So this is what happened to him. He got to Israel, and almost immediately he settled in Netanya, and he began raising funds to build what today is the Laniado Hospital, which is the most important hospital of that area. Okay. So I saw an interview where this was like, in Israel people like say what they think more than they do in America. So somebody asked him straight out, like, you suffered so much. Why do you care about other people's illnesses so much? Like, why don't you just like start all over again and rebuild your own life? So he said he made a vow. During the time that all of this horror was occurring in his life, he made a vow. The vow was, whatever the Nazis are, that's who I'm not. And as soon as I can make choices, I'm going to make choices that are antithetical to their choices. So they were cruel, I'll be kind. Okay, clear? So this was his fulfillment of his vow when he was asking himself, and who should I be in response to this? Now, there are other possibilities. Without being judgmental, because none of us experienced the horror of the Holocaust, there are many people who responded with, therefore I'll spend the rest of my life protecting myself. Okay? Therefore I'll always put myself first because nobody cares about me. Okay? Therefore I'll give up on life because life isn't worth living. You understand this? But when people made these wrong decisions, it's almost always because they didn't ask any questions. They sort of flowed into it. So you have to learn the question. The question is, who should I be now? Okay, so this is reflected by who Noach was when he left the ark. Okay? So what did he do? What was the first thing he did? Do you know? Excuse me? Planted a vineyard. Okay, why? To get drunk, that was his intent. Because the horror was overwhelming. So even though he was such a huge tzaddik, and he knew the questions to ask when he was on the ark, when he got off the ark, there was a failure. So I want to tell you something about human nature. When the choices are very extreme and black and white, it's sometimes easier to make the right choice than when the fire is off, if you know what I mean. So I'll give you an example like in real life. So how many of you keep Shabbos consistently? Okay. At least consistently here in the Bay, because there's nothing to do on Shabbos. Okay, whatever. So let's say you keep Shabbos consistently, and you've been doing so for 5 years, let's say. And you work. What do you actually work at back home? Let's say the manager of the preschool would approach you one day and say, we're expanding our program. Okay, the vast majority of women work nowadays. So preschool started, as you probably know, the original vision for preschool was to be a morning program. Virtually all preschools have afternoon programs as well. The women need weekend programs. Okay, many of them work weekends, even those who don't need, they don't need 24-hour-a-day childcare on weekends. It's too much for them. They need preschool on weekends. So you say to them, but I don't work Saturdays.
I don't work Shabbat.
I don't do Shabbat. So suppose you said, look, I understand that until now you haven't worked on Saturdays, but there's like supply and demand. If we can't supply the women with what they want, they're going to go to other preschools. We have to have a Saturday program. We have to have a Sunday program. We need people who could alternate Saturdays and Sundays because nobody wants to work 7 days. So we're putting you on for the first and third Saturdays of the month. You could have off like you want on the second and fourth. Could that happen in real life?
Yeah, sure.
It could. Look, so what you're saying is that you would be Shomer Shabbos as you do this.
Yeah.
But suppose your boss would say, look, we have a program. And this is true. I don't know if this is true in the preschool you worked in, but in many preschools this is true. You worked in a Jewish one. If you're working in a non-Jewish government-funded one, then there's defined educational goals that have to be met.
Yeah.
So we have to have creative arts. We have to have, we have to have painting. We have to have this. We have to have this. You're working in a program. You're not making a program. We can't accommodate this. Then what's your line?
I can't work it.
Well, you have to work it.
My religion is more important.
All right, you know what? I understand it's a matter of principle. I'm going to offer you $500 more a month for this.
To work on Shabbat?
Yeah.
Not happening.
What?
Not happening.
So suppose I upped it. Suppose I made it $1,000 a month.
No matter how much money
Okay.
you give
Okay,
me.
could you all picture this? That if it's put like this, break Shabbos, I'll give you money, a lot of us are going to say it's just like not negotiable. Yeah? Okay, you have the image? Not negotiable, not $1,000, $2,500. Okay, it's just not negotiable. Here you are on Shabbos, in Neve, where it's real easy. Okay, clear? And your hair looks awful. It looks like really, really awful. And you learned in the halacha class, what's the end of that sentence?
You're not supposed to like pull hair.
You can't shear that sheep on Shabbos. Okay, and like that when you brush your hair, there's hair on the brush. It didn't get there by black magic, right? Okay. Could you picture yourself more easily brushing your hair than you could taking the job for $1,000 extra? Could you see that?
Yeah.
So I want to tell you why. This is high drama and that's not high drama. If there was a voice from heaven, will you break the Sabbath for the sake of your vanity and beauty? You would say, no. Okay, clear. But it's not. It's I'll just try to be not really harsh and yeah, there are hairs on the brush, aren't there? Okay, whatever. Okay, clear? So the big dramatic moments are easier than the small but non-dramatic moments. So this was Noach's failure in that regard. He shouldn't have planted a vineyard. It was escapist from life. If he were to ask himself the question that he knew how to ask, which is, who should I be now? What do you think the ideal way of re-beginning the world would be? Plant wheat, plant.
Yeah.
Okay, got it? Now there's something else he did that was viewed as good. He offered sacrifices. So the animals, when they came onto the ark, which they did by themselves, because there's no way a human being could go all over the world and get to of every species. Okay, 7 of the animals that were later going to be kosher animals came, as opposed to 2 of all of the other animals. So he understood, even though there were no kashrut laws, that these animals are in a different category than the other animals. Okay, so he offered sacrifices from them. Now, when the animals are so endangered, like there are only 7 of each of these kind, would you offer a sacrifice? Would you kill an animal? I'd be afraid to. Okay, what's animal sacrifice for anyway? Do you know anything about it? So the word korban, you have it, comes from the word karov. Karov means near. Okay, the purpose of a korban is to take what's far, which is the animal self, and draw it near. So the actual animals that are sacrificed are meant for the person who's doing the sacrifice to find within himself. Like inside us, there's a whole menagerie of animals. Could you see where this is so? Think animalistic behaviors that you have seen. Think rock concert. No, don't think rock concert ever again in your life. Okay. Next, think of the kind of bar mitzvah where they serve buffet style, and there's plenty of let's see, what do they always have plenty of? Potato salad and egg salad, but not enough meat, okay? Or not enough Chinese food, okay, clear? So have you ever seen people who you would believe are above this sort of, really bring out the animal of them as they're sort of creeping on?
Yes, at Neve.
It's at Neve lunchtime, okay.
In the cafeteria.
Okay. You see it all. Okay, so in any case, so there are 4 steps in making a korban. So here they are. I want you to understand this because it has to do with elevating your own animal self. The first is to identify the animal. So the menagerie within you has some animals that can't be elevated. You can't elevate a tiger or a lion. You have to learn how to suppress certain kinds of animal energy. But the sheep within you, let's stick with the sheep. That's the follower, the herd instinct. Is the herd instinct good or bad? Think of lynches. Did you ever see a film of a real lynch?
A film?
Yeah, like on the news. Did you ever see?
Like I know what a lynch does. It sucks the blood.
I saw the news clip of the lynching that took place years ago in Ramallah.
Lynching.
What?
Oh, sorry. This is weird.
What? Okay. So what they had was somebody wandered into Ramallah, which is an Arab town, and a mob started following him. He ran to the police station. He thought that the police would protect him. The police joined the mob, and they killed him and threw his body out the window. And this was all filmed. Okay, so I saw this on film. So, do you think if you were to ask, I don't know how many people were in the mob. Let's say there were 500 people. Some of them might have been fairly decent people normally. Could you see this?
Yeah.
Okay, what makes a person join a mob?
Loss of self.
Loss of self. Okay, so mob instinct could be extremely unholy. Have you been to Yad Vashem?
Yes.
Did you see the film clip of Hitler going to the Reichstag and the parade in the street? Did you see that film? Like the high school girls literally jumping for joy and Okay, so that's mob instinct at its worst. Could mob instinct ever be good? Okay, soon it'll be Hanukkah, right? So here you are, the public square in Modi'in. Mattatyahu, the Kohen of the place, the Greeks trying to get him to publicly eat pig. He says, whoever's with God, follow me, and his sons get onto the stage, and before you know it, thousands of people are following them. You understand this? So it could be positive, could be negative, it could go either way. So the first thing you do when you're dealing with the animal in you is to admit that there's an animal in you. That's called selecting the animal. The next part is you have to actually lean your hands on it so you feel its vitality and its life force, and so you're totally identified with it. Okay, the next part, which is the most important part, is that the animal is killed by ordinary shechita, just like if you were killing an animal for food. But its blood is received in sanctified vessels. So the blood is the animal's soul. So the idea is that the soul is holy if you put it in a holy vessel. If not, it remains animal. So the idea is any animal urge of these permitted urges could be holy. So Rambam gives us an extreme example of this. He says, this is like more of a man thing than a woman thing. Are there people who like action? Who just like action?
Yeah. With the action movies?
Yeah, action movies, but living action movies. Boys are that way. Like when the boys are inducted into the army in Israel, all of the boys want to be in what part? They're allowed to ask to be in whatever part they want. They don't always get what they ask for. They all want to be in the paratroopers or combat soldiers, the Golani. Okay, I mean, I know one boy, like my son's friend, who actually would in his interview say, I want an indoor job that's completely safe. I want something that requires as little effort as possible. So they gave him a job. They have these like gigantic sort of places where they store uniforms, okay? So his initial job was like sizing them. You know, they would come out like all the size 42s, size 44s, okay? So he's in the army for 3 years, so like you progress a little bit. So he became like in charge of his part of this great like storage facility. So he had access to all the uniforms. In other words, people had to sign them out. They had requisition forms. He gave out the forms, so he could take whatever he wants and just like, you know. So when he would go off like on, you know, like on Chofesh, he once came to our house like in this paratrooper outfit. I said, you're the paratroopers? So he said, well, it's good for my social life. He had a pilot outfit, whatever, but in any case. But so there are people who like action, yeah? What's the worst expression of it? Joining a gang, okay? So here's a scale of better responses, okay? So Rambam says, okay, you like this. You like the blood, the guts, you like it. So don't say I'm going to be an accountant. This isn't going to work. You could be a shochet. You could be a mohel. You could work in the emergency room. You could be a doctor. You understand this? But you have to find something that's real. You have to put it in a holy vessel. Okay, clear? Okay, the final part is at least some part of the animal has to be offered on the altar. Okay? So the idea is that something has to be sacrificed. You have to be willing to say no to something. It can't all be yes. Okay, clear? So Noach offered sacrifices. So by doing that, he created a foundation whereby the world now is redeemable. Yes, we admit that we have animal instincts, but we'll deal with them. Okay, so at that point, God said, now I see that you know that the human heart is evil from early youth, okay, which is true, okay, but you'll deal with it. So the phrase, Ki yetzer adam ra mi'ne'urav, that the human heart is evil from early youth. I want to explain this. The yetzer hara is the part of us that loves destruction. Could you see where this is so? Yeah. We all start out with that. So even like very young children, you know, just picture a 2-year-old building a Lego tower. What's the fate of every single Lego tower? The same hands that build them are the hands that push them down, right?
Or another pair of hands.
Okay, or another pair of hands, okay. So Nietzsche, did any of you read, no, if you were to read Nietzsche, you did? Yeah, the German, yeah. So he fed on Schopenhauer before that, Hegel's, but his philosophy was that the joy of destruction is as great as the joy of creation. Could you see where this is so? So we all start like that. Little children are very self-oriented. Okay, imagine telling a 5-month-old baby, last night I was up with you all night. Now it's my turn. So tonight you sleep, and I'll be, okay, no, this isn't, let's take turns. It's not going to work with a 5-month-old. For them, there's only a self, right? Yeah. Okay, you could argue very young babies don't even catch on that their mothers are human. Did you ever see this, like a baby trying to suck the mother's nose or cheek or head? Because like the mother's just like a food object, you know, like let's try this, let's try that. Okay, so as you get older, your sensitivity to other people becomes greater. So by the time a child is, let's say, 5, so their world, which when they were 1 day old was only about them, who else is in their world now? Mommy, who else? Abba, maybe a few siblings. Anybody else? Probably not. Go up to 10. Who's in a 10-year-old's world? Siblings, friends, maybe some extended relatives, grandma, grandpa, aunt this, aunt that, cousin this, cousin that, yeah? Neighbors. Okay, now I want you to ask yourself, how many people do you think are in your world? How many people are in your world, people you care about, whose names you know? How many of you would say 1,000? Okay, how about 500? How about 200? How about 150? How about 100? Okay, okay. Okay, so what that's telling you is you became much, much bigger and more human since you were born. So it doesn't mean the baby is evil, but it does mean that the baby doesn't have your capacity for self-expansion. So the real tzaddikim have circles that include many more people than your circle or mine. You could see where this is so? So I want to tell you what this looks like. Do you know what the Entebbe rescue was? You know what I'm talking about? So a plane carrying many Jews was hijacked and taken to Entebbe. Entebbe is in Uganda. Uganda is a Muslim black nation in Africa, extremely, extremely, I want to think of the right word, far from Western values, okay? So the people who captured it set forth conditions with the Israeli authorities. They wanted many, many prisoners freed in exchange for the captives on the plane. Today, they for sure would have gotten what they wanted. I want to just tell you this because things are different now than they were then. But at that point, the government's policy was not to give in to those sorts of pressures, okay? So if you were watching the news then like everybody in Israel was, what would you think would be the fate of these people? They're dead. That's what this is what I was saying. They're dead. There's like nothing to talk about. In fact, a rescue operation was designed and worked. So Netanyahu's brother, Yoni Netanyahu, who was in the army then and a commander, organized a rescue. So the way it worked is that they sent in a plane going lower than the radar, not above the radar, below. The plane in its hold had cars with people in it, okay? So they came out, like the plane lands, and it had Ugandan markings on it, like they thought it was one of their planes. The side opens and these black cars come out, like they filmed everything, okay? They were copies of the presidential car. So within seconds, like soldiers start coming out, but those few seconds bought them enough time to get into the waiting area, grab the hostages, get them on the plane, shoot the guards, and leave. Okay, so this was like a huge miracle. You could see this? Okay, the only one who was killed in this whole operation was the commander himself, Yoni Netanyahu. All of the soldiers came back. So the reason why I'm telling you this is the days elapsed between the hijacking and the rescue. So most people related to the people who were on this plane, which everybody was thinking about this. It's like, this is an irredeemable situation. So one of the mornings between the hijacking and the rescue in Miri Yeshiva, the Rosh Yeshiva at the time, whose name was Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, was found early in the morning. He had gotten up before anybody. He went down to the central Beis Midrash. He opened the ark, and he was standing in front of the Torah scrolls weeping. So somebody said, "Who do you have on the plane?" And he said, "I don't know anybody on the plane, but there are people on the plane." So to him, his circle was big enough to expand to people whose names he doesn't know. You understand this? So this is what being truly human is about. So God saw the will to offer sacrifices as a will to get beyond the animal self, which is very predatory, very contained, and never expands, to being human. So he gave a promise that he would never destroy the world to this extent again. So the sign of the fulfillment of this promise is the rainbow. So whenever you see a rainbow, it's a sign that God is saying, no matter how irredeemable the world is, I will not destroy it because humans have the capacity to change. So the rainbow is meant to be shaped like a bow and arrow. It's as though we're shooting arrows at God and His will, but He's responding with compassion. Okay, so when you see a rainbow, it's not a sign of how good we are, it's a sign of how our survival is only there because of God's compassion. Okay, so there's a blessing to say when you see a rainbow, and the idea there is it's a blessing for God's compassion, because we don't pay our air bills, we don't pay our gravity bills, and we do a lot of despoiling and horror. So that's what a rainbow is about. Okay, more next time.